big on formalities?
I'm not. So that people can speak what's on their mind. If I'm going to hear what truly people think, they have to feel comfortable telling me.
The most memorable moment you had as a student was what?
So I'm going to have two memorable moments, a positive one and a negative one, and I'll talk about the negative one first. So when I was a second year undergraduate, and I was a biochemistry student, I took a course in chemical thermodynamics, which was actually a required course. And that course, 70% of the mark was on the final exam. I answered 2 out of 9 questions and got a B+. And I really don't think that should ever happen to students. In the sense that this was a course that, in the way that it was instructed, in the expectations of the student population, there was just zero expectation that anybody could possibly do well. And so the result was that you had a mammoth bell curve, so that somebody that literally, and I know I only had 2 questions answered, I only tried 3, and I know I got 2 of them right, could end up with a reasonable grade. And I really think that in our approach at Laurentian, we have to ensure that the pedagogy and student engagement is such that students don't have to go through something like that.
I can tell all these years later, it still bothers you.
Well, it was, I came out of that exam thinking I'd failed the first course in my life and that my career was over. And it turned out it wasn't so, and I didn't understand that either because I knew I'd failed the exam. And so having, I think we need to provide a positive reinforcing experience for students where expectations are realistic. And I think that is really, really important.
Any other memorable moment?
It was December 25th, Christmas morning. I was in the lab, and at the time I was working to study gene expression in avian systems in chickens in a particular area, and I had to do dissection on 114 dozen eggs. And that morning, and my supervisor came in to help me, and I think that kind of dedication by faculty, for him to come in on Christmas morning to help me, the student. I came in on Christmas morning because that was simply the timing of the experiment and it had to be done. But there was no reason that he needed to come. And I think that really sets to me, an example of the dedication that our faculty can have for students and how important that really is.
You have researched DNA extensively. Would you have your own DNA sequenced?
That's a really interesting question because as it happens, coincidentally, the very first thing I did as a graduate student was to set up DNA sequencing in the laboratory that I went to. And it was actually the first DNA sequencing that was set up at the university, because it was just at the time that it was becoming known. And I will say that at that time, although we were only sequencing about 300 nucleotides at a time as opposed to the billions that comprise the human genome, I was tempted to try and do a little sequencing of my own DNA. Today, when you can have your own genome sequenced for basically $1,000, I haven't been lined up yet to do that to mine. I think fundamental to my humanity is not knowing what my DNA really looks like. Because I'm sure there's some bad news there, and I prefer to have the good news.
And the curiosity is not killing you?
The curiosity is no longer killing me. There was a time when the curiosity was there, it was new, it was fascinating. Now, as I've grown older, there's been less curiosity.
Let me ask you the $64,000 question that you've probably been asked 64,000 times. What attracted you to this opportunity at Laurentian?
What attracted me to Laurentian was simply the potential of the university. I think it has come such a long way in the 60 years of its history, and it has such great potential to have an impact for the North, for Canada, and for around the world. I mean, there's some really fundamentally great programs that happen at Laurentian. People that come here, students that come here get a great education, and there's the potential to do so much more. Plus, it's in a bilingual, tricultural environment, very, different, diverse kinds of people, diverse opinions, and it's just really, for me, and coming from my background, and looking forward to how I can hopefully contribute and make a difference for an institution, it just seemed to be very much the right opportunity at the right time.
Ever since Franklin Roosevelt, the first 100 days have become a thing. What do you want to do in your first 100 days?
In my first 100 days, I really want to get a true sense for the community. What's important to the community, how the community likes to express itself, how to engage the community in a productive, positive way. And I really want to get to know people, to continue to grow the relationship so that people can get to know me as much as I get to know them. And then we can have, you know, a really good working relationship over the next almost 5 years.
Rob, how is it you know French so well?
Well, I'm Acadian by background, and so French is my mother tongue, and certainly it's something that's been important in family life as I grew up. But I also was an Army brat, and so have lived all over the country, have lived in Europe, and in fact, I learned French, English, and German all at the same time when I was 2 years old. Now my German is much worse than my French, but it is something that my family is Francophone. Father is Acadian, my mother is from Quebec. My grandmother was British. She was a First World War bride, and never spoke a word of French. It was just not for want of trying, but never could. So for me, it's more about the bilingualism than the Francophone per se, because it is the environment in which I grew up in. And it is something that I found that is really appealing to me and appealing to my family at large.
How do you see Laurentian's research capabilities and ambitions changing under your leadership?
So I hopefully don't see them changing, but I do see them evolving. I think Laurentian has tremendous potential as a research institution. It has some really spectacular recent success. I think Laurentian really holds the key to Canada's future in many ways, in the sense that the North is key to the future of Canada, and Laurentian and the research that's done at Laurentian is really key to the North, both from an industrial perspective, but also from a human and societal perspective.
Rob, international students can go anywhere in the world they want to. Why should they come to Sudbury?
For a true Canadian experience. I think there is, you come to Laurentian, you come to Sudbury, and it's really a microcosm of the Canadian experience. English, French, Indigenous, working together, interacting together. So from a cultural perspective, a really great cultural experience, and a top-notch university, a really first-rate education. There are programs at Laurentian that are nationally leading and some of the best in the world.
I don't have to tell you how challenging an environment it is for all universities right now. How do you think Laurentian can distinguish itself in this climate?
I think Laurentian already distinguishes itself in some really fantastic ways. University for the North, the focus on indigeneity, focus on rural and community health, focus on the mining industry, focus on Indigenous architecture. I mean, there are wonderfully distinct programs at Laurentian, and I think that the challenge and the opportunity for us at this time is how to grow the visibility and the strength of those programs.
Here's a very open-ended question. What are you most proud of?
I think that's maybe the easiest question that you've asked me. I think naturally I'm most proud of my children. I think that's an easy one. We have 4 children, and they're mostly out of the house. And you know, despite our best efforts, you might say, they're doing wonderfully, and I'm really proud of them.
How many still live with you?
Sort of half of one, in the sense that we have one who's still an undergraduate, but he's away at school, so he's at home, I guess, 4 or 5 months out of the year.
Gotcha. What does success look like for you in this role?
Success for me is a sense 5 years from now around the university that the university is accomplishing things, is moved forward, and that pride in the institution that I was talking about has grown. So it's really, I look for success in the university reflected in everyone that I'll meet during the course of a day.
The best advice someone ever gave you, what was it?
So I think the best advice I've ever received, and it was a long, long time ago, was only worry about what you can control. You can't control your height, you can't control your smarts, but you can control your heart. And really focus on those things, how hard you work, what you're committed to, find your passion, and then make a difference there.
The role of international travel in your life, how important?
Yeah, it's international travel, it's really it's not so, I would phrase it as international experiences rather than travel per se. Having had the ability to live not only around the country, but to have spent extensive time in Europe and to visit other countries, I think it just really, it's a constant reminder of how different we are around the world, but how inside we're all the same. And so that people can be as different on the outside as they can be, but the fundamental values and what drives people is so similar from place to place.
I remember when you and I first met, we went to a Toronto coffee shop, and you didn't have coffee, and you didn't have tea, you had water. What's the story there?
Well, I actually don't drink coffee or tea. I never acquired a taste for it. For whatever reason, I'm not sure why. So the way I like to say it is you get all natural enthusiasm with me, no artificial stimulants.
Okay, we're going to do a lightning round here. So I'm going to ask fast questions and we'll get fast answers, and we'll go, I think it'll be easier to go all English and then all French for this. So here we go. Do you call it a camp or a cottage?
Yeah, I can't give you a fast answer for that one. I can give you a longer one. So here you call it a camp, and I grew up. A good part of my growing up was in Quebec, on the south shore of Montreal. And what I learned in Quebec was that if it was north of the St. Lawrence, it was a camp, and if it was south of the St. Lawrence, it was a cottage. As we're north of the St. Lawrence here, it makes sense that it's camp.
Montreal Canadiens, Toronto Maple Leafs, or something else?
Habs.
Oh, and I thought we were going to get along so well. Okay, F1 or NASCAR?
F1.
If you could speak another language, which would it be?
Oh, there's a bit of a cue for that because I'm presently learning Japanese, and I've committed to as well to learn some Anishinaabe. But after that, I'm thinking my next language would be Portuguese.
If you could have dinner with anyone, dead or alive, who would it be and why?
So that's an interesting question because there are literally so many people that you could name to answer that question. So the one that strikes me today would be Barbara McClintock. So Barbara McClintock was a scientist, actually a cytogeneticist. She worked on corn genetics in the 1930s and 40s. She was a woman very much ahead of her time. First of all, she was a woman scientist at a very difficult time, and she made some fundamental discoveries in genetics that subsequently went unrecognized for 20 years. She actually stopped publishing at one point in the 1950s because nobody believed what she was doing. And in 1983, they awarded her the Nobel Prize in Medicine for the work that she'd done in the 30s and 40s. I think it would just be fascinating to have a conversation with her on how she persevered in her work through those times.
Your favorite place to visit and why?
My favorite place to visit is the next place I visit. I think there's so many fascinating places. My favorite place has changed over the years, it's evolved, but really I just have a love for new experiences.
When you were a kid, what did you want to be when you grew up?
When I was in my early teens, there was a summer where there was a flurry of congressional hearings in the United States over recombinant DNA technology. It was just the time that there was a fundamental conversation about was this safe and was this something to do. And because it was during the summer, actually I found myself as a young teenager, imagine that, watching congressional hearings, becoming fascinated with the technology that they were talking about. And I think, 10 years later, when it was time to choose a major in college, I chose biochemistry, in large part because that's where you went to study molecular biology, which was what was being talked about.
Watergate hearings when I was a kid. I ended up in journalism. Same thing.
This was a couple years before Watergate.
If you weren't a university president, what would you be doing for a living?
I don't know. I don't know what I'd be doing for a living. If I didn't go down the university path, I probably would be a lawyer, because I was accepted to law school at that. As I completed my PhD, it was, do I continue in an academic career or do I get a real job? And so I actually applied to law school and was accepted, but ultimately decided to continue on my academic path.
Enfin, finally, why Laurentian?
Because Laurentian just strikes me as a place with such terrific potential. It's such a warm community, enthusiastic community. I think it's something that's really going to be, hopefully I can give as much to Laurentian as I expect Laurentian will give to me over the next 5 years.
Monsieur le Recteur, bonne chance. Good luck.